in search of Black Power. I'm your co-host, Lawrence Grand Prix. So, a little bit behind the scenes here in terms of the podcast. As many of you probably suspect, we're very busy. So we record these podcasts sometimes months in advance. Usually, we pick topics that are evergreen. It's not a problem. For this one, it's a bit more tricky. If you've seen the TV show The Wire, you know that Baltimore is driven by one number more than any other number, and that is the number of murders in a year. During the era of crack and the violence associated with it, the number that was used as a metric for emergency, failure, was 300 murders per year. In this current era, 2022, post-pandemic, we saw a spike of murders when murder rate actually got above 300 to about 350 almost. After the Baltimore uprising in 2015, for many years afterwards, Baltimore's murders were over 300. This has been used to create a sense of hysteria, emergency, investment in police, rebuking, defund the police, all these things. But with 2020, that was not defund the police, but that were predictable, giving the aging out of the baby boom generation substantial retirements in the police force. So Baltimore's police force have actually declined substantially since 2020, from about a high of around 2,500 to about 1,900. Now, 2,500 police in the city of around 600,000 people would still make it per capita one of the most policed cities in the country. It remains so at 1,900 police, but a strange thing happened. As the number of police dropped from 2,500 to 1,900 today, the murder rate dropped precipitously. The murder rate in Baltimore has actually dropped faster and more substantially than just about anywhere else in America, and faster and more substantially than almost any time in Baltimore's history. As of the recording of this podcast, which is December 2024, Baltimore is at around 180 murders. If we stay below 200 murders, it'll be the first time in over 10 years, we stay below 200 murders. This is reflective of a nationwide pattern in many, but not all, major Democrat-run cities, that they are experiencing lower levels of police staffing and substantial declines in murder, in many cases beyond the low murder rate pre-pandemic. And the question is why? And that'll be the topic of this episode, because the debate as to who gets the credit for the decrease in homicides is not just here in Baltimore, but nationwide, and deals with a two-pronged problem for those of us that are interested in community-based solutions to violence. Here in Baltimore, the groups of folks that go out and talk to people in community have basically rallied for the past decade, and only really with the funding that's come with the American Rescue Plan Act and strategic investments in philanthropy and other pots of money locally, they've had the space and time and resources to actually do the work needed to reach people on the ground and build out the trust and ecosystem to deal with violence. But that's not the narrative you get nationwide. On the right, you get the narrative that it is intense police tactics, targeted enforcement, increased prosecution of criminal networks, so-called targeted policing, that's led to these declines. And on the left, you actually get an interesting alternative narrative. They agree that it is programming that's helped get the murders down, but they specifically link the success to a public health-based approach, a public health solution to violence. They often say defund the police, fund public health solutions to violence. And in Baltimore, we argue that both the left and the right have it wrong. That the community, here in Baltimore at least, has chosen to stand up and change the norms around community violence, has been able to deal with folks who may carry guns for personal protection, but convince them not to use them in acts of aggression. And that that's happened not because of our extensive and expansive public health ecosystems, but in many ways despite it. It has obviously not happened because of many of the right-wing hardcore policing tactics, but interestingly, the public health establishment and the police have had a lot of cooperation and a lot of affinities between them, in many ways trying to freeze the grassroots out of the conversation about funding and credit for one of the most remarkable and important declines in violence in recent American history. So that'll be the topic of today's conversation between myself, Lawrence Grand Prix, and LBS Director of Public Policy, Dayvon Love, who deserves the credit for the decline in homicides. As always, we thank you, and we ask you to continue to support us at lbsbaltimore.com. You can go there and sign up to be a sustainer. This is the kind of work that we get to do to support our grassroots allies who go into community every week, engage in conflicts before they happen. It is your support that gives us the time and the space to continue to advocate for those folks. We recently just got $1 million of our opioid settlement fund here in Baltimore City allocated to We Are Us, a grassroots community violence organization that we've supported for years. Please continue to support Black Liberation Media. Please check them out on Patreon. And I will see you all on the other side. Enjoy.
So, Lawrence, one of the things that, we've worked on together and with many other organizations for many years is this issue of community-based violence prevention. And, one of the things that I'm proud of when I think about our advocacy on our police accountability work and some of our other criminal justice reform work is that we've always made it a point to pair our advocacy to push back against the dehumanization that the criminal justice system has done to our people, to pair that with advocacy for addressing violence that happens in our community, but addressing violence in a way that does not center on law enforcement. And, a very important national story that I don't think gets enough credit and isn't told in the way that it needs to be told is that while Baltimore City says that it has a shortage of police officers, Baltimore has experienced some of the most dramatic declines in homicides and non-fatal shootings in about 50 years or so. And so with that, so a part of what I want to discuss, because, there was a CNN story that attributed it to GVRS, which is kind of like this focused deterrence model. Now, I know what you and I believe is that it's community-based violence prevention has really been the center of that. But I don't know that I don't believe that they're very mainstream stories that really put that into focus. And so part of it is, so in, the CNN story that I just, mentioned and quite frankly criticized for, again, holding on to that law enforcement centric narrative around violence prevention. There becomes this conversation about who and what to attribute the decline in homicides to. And so just give me some of your thoughts about what should be attributed to the decline in homicides in Baltimore City and what's at stake in what is attributed to that decline.
So, Dayvon, I think what's at stake is how we as a people and politically orient ourselves to the distribution of resources and power. Because part of what drew me to community-based violence prevention was the argument when we started looking at safe streets in 2015, the backlash they were getting from the FOP, accusations that people were actually planting drugs in safe street sites in order to discredit them, was that if this works, we don't have to fund the police the way we do. So this whole defund the police thing, many people say Black folks weren't with that. We've talked about that. I think part of our argument is you have to make an infrastructure for abolition. People have concerns about their public safety, and they've been sold a story about policing, and they're not going to be okay with eliminating policing until they know that they have something else that works in the way that they see functioning in their community. Now, part of what's happening with GVRS, and Baltimore particularly as a model, is that the political class of Baltimore has been very effective at blending conversations of focused deterrence with conversations on community violence intervention. So when many people say GVRS, gun violence reduction strategy, they think they're saying safe streets. They think they're saying public health approaches to gun violence because they actually call some of the policing-centric focused deterrence stuff influenced by public health approaches. Influence things like epidemiology, hotspots. You see a proliferation of a disease in a particular place, you send your resources there. In this case, the disease is violence. So,
real quick, just for the people that are listening, before you go on, because I'm sure this will help people listen and understand what you're about to explain, explain, like, what is GVRS?
Exactly, yeah.
And then when you say safe streets, like, what is that?
So GVRS is a term the city has been using to describe its comprehensive gun violence strategy. That includes focused deterrence, which is sending police to particular, not just neighborhoods, but social networks. So it's increased surveillance, coordinating between federal, state, and local law enforcement on not gangs as we know them like Bloods and Crips, but cliques, community groups, units that are adjacent to violence or have been victims of violence or perpetrators of violence. And basically going to them, knocking on their door, saying, hey, look, we have some resources for you, but also we know you're outside, and if we catch you with a gun, we're going to throw you under the jail. That used to be concentrated in one big moment called the call-in, when they put a bunch of people in the room, basically told them, we know who you are, we know you outside. This is your chance to basically go straight, or we're going to send the police after you, but here's the pastor with some resources if you want them. They tried that 3 times in Baltimore. It didn't work any of the times they tried it. Now, they blamed that on a lack of follow-through on the resources. I think there's a lot of concern that maybe the model is really too police-centric, even though it claims to be better than the old school model, which is, a lot of police sweeping the streets, just cracking heads, gun trace task force type stuff. Now, that is a police-centric model, but it's seen as better, smarter, informed by science, informed by public health, different than the old school policing. So they'll oftentimes call that a public health informed gun violence reduction strategy. That's the same language they use to describe the Cure Violence, Safe Streets, Credible Messenger model. Now that model is when people who are formally engaged in street groups, street economics, street so-called gangs, who have the ability to be credible messengers, go into community and mediate conflicts either before they happen or mediate conflicts after they happen to prevent retaliation. So this is a less police or no police-centric model that has gotten a lot of support from community because it's been seen as engaging organic networks that have been doing grassroots violence prevention for years before any of this became something that was grant funded, for years before any of this became part of the public health industry. Black folks have been doing this, whether it's the Nation of Islam, churches, people associated with the Black Panthers or the Black Guerrilla family doing this stuff behind the walls, in jail, or in the streets. But it has become an industry and part of the public health nonprofit industrial complex over the past 20 years. Now in Baltimore, both of these programs are managed out of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, MONSE. This is not the norm in other cities. Other cities keep an intentional firewall between their police-centric stuff and their community-based violence prevention stuff as we know it, the Safe Streets, public credible messenger stuff. But in Baltimore, they're under the same shop. So part of the concern about GVRS giving the credit is not only is it giving credit to the police-centric stuff, but it's giving credit to a model that basically ties the street violence, credible messenger stuff to the police in the same ecosystem.
And I imagine a part of that, in terms of what's at stake in terms of that question, the attribution, is because even when you think about like the current Baltimore City State's Attorney, Ivan Bates, who really his electoral mandate was really on the kind of law and order, tough on crime agenda. And in many respects, I know when he talks about GVRS, right, he's talking about the police-centric stuff. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think you were telling me yesterday about the fact that there was some situation where the FOP, can you talk about that? I know you remember.
Yeah, so this is in Washington, D.C., down the street from us in Baltimore. So there was a city council person who was indicted for taking kickbacks. The city council person said controversial things about people controlling the weather, stuff like that. But he took over $100K in kickbacks, and those kickbacks were from a community violence prevention organization that was funded by money from the city. So a few weeks ago, I believe, the Washington, D.C. Fraternal Order of Police, the police union in Washington, D.C., published a letter which basically said, look, the fact that this corruption came from a violence prevention organization proves the whole industry is corrupt, proves the whole industry is junk science. It is not real public safety. It is thugs and people who claim to formally be in the streets, formally claim to be street affiliated, but we think they're still doing bad stuff. They're still bad dudes. You shouldn't be giving them money. You should just get rid of all the funding for community violence prevention. So this goes to that tension between the police and traditional public safety models and them trying to take credit for violence declines so that they keep the monopoly on the industry of public safety. And just to talk a little bit about focused deterrence. So one of the things that people keep saying is we need evidence-based strategies. So just locking up people for dime bags of weed, that's not an evidence-based strategy to decrease violence. But what they claim is like, well, if we actually focus our policing on particular social networks associated with hotspots of violence or known to be related to violence, that is evidence-based. Now, I would say two things. One, there's no real understanding of what drives violence at a macro level. We know that poverty, we know that from our perspective, the legacy of racism, internalized self-hatred, drives the core, the root cause of violence. So what we know is focused deterrence does nothing to solve the root cause of violence. Now, can it solve some at the median? I would say that it can probably delay it. And what we see is places like New Orleans that had some of the most vigorous application of focused deterrence actually had a massive increase in violence with the pandemic. And I think that's an example of these strategies come in so late. They come in so far right when this network's about to pull the gun and shoot, that if you have any disruption to the ecosystem, all the drivers of violence are still there. And take the New Orleans example, which had an explosion of violence with the pandemic, compared to Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey has a robust, community-based violence prevention ecosystem that's intervening upstream, mediating conflicts, telling people stuff like, if you have an illegal gun and you feel like you need it for safety, I get it, but don't use it against your brother. Don't use it against someone that looks like you. So they're doing deep prevention work with their violence model when they were able to maintain a 40% cut in violence through the pandemic when everyone else in the country was exploding in violence. I think that is a good example to challenge the hegemony that focused deterrence is an evidence-based strategy. Obviously, if you lock up someone that's like, I'm going to shoot that dude, and you don't shoot that dude, that's going to do something. So I'm not saying it's entirely bunk. I'm saying it does not address the root causes of violence. It creates very fragile, and I believe temporary violence declines. And then we as a community want to see long-lasting violence declines. We need to mediate conflicts upstream and address the root causes of violence.
So would it be fair to say then that the perspective that we're offering in terms of the focus on community-based violence prevention, the focus on the importance of some of the more culturally rooted things that deal with some of the root causes, the self-alienation, the kind of internalized feelings of inferiority and criminality, that those approaches are more effective than the approaches that use focused deterrence? Like, would that be a fair? Because I think for the listeners, there's certainly a political element to it. Like, we have, given the policies that we move, we have a political incentive to push back against law enforcement, to say that law enforcement should not be centered in the conversation around public safety. So we have a political interest given our perspective. But just to put a finer point on what you just laid out, would it be fair to say that what we're offering is actually, and the evidence to support it, lends itself to the fact that this approach is more effective at public safety than the traditional models that the FOP and others like it would want people to endorse?
So I believe the answer is yes, but we have to take the evidence in its totality. One of the things the focused deterrence advocates do not account for is the criminogenic effects of incarceration. So while they claim this is more targeted and precise than the mass incarceration that comes with locking people up for dime bags of weed, little bits of coke, drug possession, you still are targeting social networks. And you're targeting those networks pretty expansively through things like RICO cases, through things like criminalizing entire social networks. Now, we know some people in those networks may be real drivers of violence. Some people might just be adjacent to that violence. Some people may just be related to people doing that violence. And when you're criminalizing entire networks, you're still putting people in jail where they're exposed to separation from community. They're exposed to trauma. Many of the youths are put in the adult system here in Maryland in ways that many people say you learn how to be a better criminal in jail. So studies have shown that people who are incarcerated for longer periods of time, as they are known to do when you're talking about violent crime, as compared to short incarceration stints with some low-level drug crime, that is intensely more criminogenic than that low-level incarceration. So yes, you are not taking whole swaths of the community and locking them up, but you're taking people that may be peripheral to networks of crime and potentially putting long sentences on them. And they can be much worse when they come out and much more likely to commit violence when they come out. So I think when you look at the work of Michael Mueller-Smith, who was actually at University of Michigan, when he wrote his report basically saying that when you look at the evidence over a long term, accounting for this criminogenic effect of prisons, incarceration does more to drive violence than it does to deter violence. I think the focused deterrence model actually magnifies that by focusing on networks of people and putting long sentences on them for relatively minor crimes being associated with assault, second degree assault, and things like that adding up to these years and years on people who otherwise might be living their lives, who otherwise may not be tied to criminal networks, may age out of violent criminality. Because of that incarceration, they may be more likely to stay in those networks. The other thing he says finally is that when you lock somebody up in a criminal network or a network of people who have to engage in survival economics, you basically create a job opening in that social network because millions of people are doing jobs. They're lookouts, they're holding weapons, holding stashes. It's a network of survival economics. So basically you have to account for the fact that when you put somebody in jail, you are now bringing a new person in to that adjacency to violence, into that network, that street network where they're peripheral to violence. And then that other person you sent to jail comes out worse than when they came in. So you're creating this conveyor belt of people exposed to the risk of violence. So I think that proves to me that focused deterrence, especially alone, focused deterrence alone definitely can't be an effective strategy. While I think that you do see some potential evidence that community-based violence intervention can be effective with or without focused deterrence, right? So I think that it would much be a better overall investment to focus the money, especially given how much focused deterrence costs. Focused deterrence is very expensive. Lots of money, lots of data, lots of tracking, lots of connections to the feds and the local, and it's actually a very intensive, expensive model, which is probably why police actually don't mind it, right? Mm. This is actually a new way for them to get their bag. So compare that to the cost of community violence intervention. I think it's definitely a better investment.
And one of the things I'll add quickly before we go on to the next part of the conversation, one of the things I think is an inherent assumption, and in some ways a societal assumption when it comes to homicide in, cities like Baltimore and places around the country, is that drug trafficking is the driver of it. And we're seeing data. I know you mentioned MONSE, which is the agency we have in Baltimore City. They did a report where they looked at the Western District, which historically was one of the most violent districts, police districts in the city. And they did an analysis of, what caused the individual homicides in that district. And drug trafficking was like third or fourth. The leading causes were things like, personal disputes that got out of hand, right? Or, a robbery that went wrong. And I'm mentioning that to say that even the law enforcement centric approach, when you think about what law enforcement often says it needs to address violence, they're addressing violence as if drug trafficking is the driver of violence in our community. And there may have been times where it was kind of the dominant force in terms of what, drove violence in our communities. We know now that certainly isn't the case based on the data that I've referenced in the Western District. But I just wanted to add that as well, because I think the conversation about focused deterrence, you're talking about like people engaged in deliberate illegal activity, when in fact, the work that you said that was happening in Newark, the preventative work of like getting to people before a conflict escalates out of control, because that is actually a bigger contributor to the homicides and violence that we're seeing than the kind of societal narratives we get about crime and violence that centers these kind of dangerous criminal organized enterprises as the center of the narratives that we have, and therefore drives the kind of policies that law enforcement has. So I think the community-based violence prevention approach really actually aligns in a more evidence-based way in terms of what are the biggest contributors to violence in our community. Let's shift gears a little bit. One of the things that has emerged, you mentioned cure violence, and one of the things that has emerged is the public health sector, the industry, and the notion that dealing with public safety is a public health issue, right? Not necessarily a criminal justice issue. But, as you and I have talked and, we've written and, been publicly critical of the public health establishment. So can you talk about, like, what are the dangers? Because I think some people would describe our position as the public health sector is insufficient in dealing with some of our concerns about the public health establishment's role in community-based violence prevention. But what I want to get really deep on, and if you can talk about what are the dangers of community-based violence prevention being institutionalized within the public health industry.
So I've talked about this quite a bit. I think there is this assumption that public health is useful as a way to decenter the prison and police. So when you compare prisons and police to public health, the idea is that, well, public health is evidence-based, public health is scientific, and that's going to allow us to have the data challenge the flawed assumptions around mass incarceration and be more politically palatable to fund something if it's tied to the public health establishment. I think when you look at public health, particularly from a pan-African perspective, look at the public health interventions overseas, where folks are literally giving folks drugs that they are not allowed to use here in America. They're, had all these patent protections, all these dangerous vaccines, and more importantly, I believe, they strategically intervene in other countries, not to give them indigenous public health capacity, not to actually do things like primary care and to do things like tied to indigenous healers in the African nations, but to really control dangerous outbreaks of disease that could hurt the economy, that could hurt international trade. Many folks internationally see public health as an extension of a colonial capitalist regime. So I think bringing that here to America, I think something very similar is happening with violence. You cannot gentrify Baltimore if more than 300 bodies are dropping. So public health is a way to not actually intervene the root cause of disease, the so-called disease of violence, the poverty, the internalized self-hatred, the white supremacy, to deal with the artifacts of that threaten the stuff that institutions actually care about, i.e. economic development. So it allows them to deal with the most deepest excesses of capitalism and white supremacy without redistributing power. In fact, further centering power in elite institutions like Johns Hopkins, in elite institutions like University of Chicago, and denying the community capacity to govern itself. I would also say that just think about public health. Like, one of the core contexts of public health is surveillance. Like, they literally say surveillance is like at the core of public health. Like, you got to see if there's tuberculosis or whatever. So it is a deeply surveillance technology. It is a deeply controlled technology. I know that's taboo to say because people are now linking that to the whole Trump attacks on public health. But when you think about it from the perspective of violence as a disease, who's patient zero? Who's Typhoid Mary? If you see violence in America as a disease, we have indigenous, I would say, health concepts that exceed what the public health industry can accommodate. That would say, that looks like Christopher Columbus to me. And when you build an indigenous healing perspective that sees the human as holistic, then you start thinking about public health interventions like the folks from the Nation of Islam, who have been leading in violence prevention in this space using a holistic understanding of the person. The public health ecosystem is the exact opposite. It's about atomizing the individual to control them. And again, it's very easy to pathologize the community, not that violence is a disease, but the black people doing the violence are the disease. And we have to cure them by interventions from a white or at least Eurocentric ideology-dominated public health industry. So it's a powerful technology to pathologize community, to blame the victim, to blame the people who have been fighting on the ground to fight the disease of violence put into us by the very systems that are now claiming to come save us from the disease of violence. So it's a very effective evolution of the control schema of white supremacy by lifting up public health as a solution to the problems that the people like Mike Stop and Frisk Bloomberg, who basically created the conditions we're trying to respond to in the first place.
So just as a follow-up, just to put a pin on it, because you and I went to an event where, and you mentioned the Nation of Islam, and some of the work that they've been doing for, many decades at this point is around community-based community-based violence prevention, reentry, stuff like that. So you and I attended a program where, part of it was kind of a commemoration of the 29th year anniversary of the Million Man March from October 16th, 1995. But it was also a youth program that was run by folks that are affiliated with the Nation of Islam, and many other folks that are involved in this program. So it isn't like an exclusively a Nation of Islam program, but many of those folks are the people that run it and provide some of the foundational framework. And so for the listeners for whom community-based violence prevention is abstract to them. And you think about like the event we went to last night where you have folks that are formerly incarcerated, people who are formerly, engaged in street activity. And there's certain kinds of messages, a certain way that they can get to the young people that are in that program. And if you can, again, it's because the purpose of this is just to put a finer point on this distinction in terms of the public health industry and its limitations. Give a sense of how would a traditional public health person have experienced that room in ways that might do some of the pathologizing that you described. Like if you think about your traditional public health person, they're in that room. Like what are the things they wouldn't understand are important, that their lack of understanding of that importance would actually exacerbate the problem in our community?
So I think some examples may come from the perspective of the focus on discipline. Mm-hmm. So whether it's almost every speaker, it's like, pay attention, engage in the crowd, like really directly confrontation, like this is important. These are Black men coming, taking time out of their day because they love you. And that demands a certain attention that I think the importance of that would be lost on a lot of people. Like these are just people speaking to kids. But also it's like the discipline in the room could be pathologized in a way that's like, oh, that's traumatizing. That's not, some people read Paulo Freire, talk about pedagogy and just sit in a circle and let people do what they want and call that critical pedagogy, right? But it's like the discipline is an instantiation of the love that people need to see demonstrated to them because they have been so told that people don't care about them, that they are not deserving of love. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the types of specific cultural technologies that risk being pathologized. I also believe that, the focus on emotion, desire, intention, those things can be pathologized from the perspective of like cognitive behavioral therapy, where it's always about you have to check your emotions. You have to challenge your thoughts. You have to constantly deconstruct your thoughts. While in spaces where you see people from a more community-centered perspective, it's like you have to think about things from a spiritual perspective. You may be asked like, what would your ancestors tell you? What would your mother tell you? What is the spirit telling you? Those don't process within the cognitive behavioral therapy framework because for African people, cognition is tied to spirit and tied to body in a way that, again, this all has implications about who gets funded. When these requests for proposals for who gets funded literally say you have to have an evidence-based methodology, and something like cognitive behavioral therapy is seen as the gold standard in violence prevention spaces, then those sort of abstract, Eurocentric, public health, very therapy-like perspectives ignore all the spiritual, cultural, and again, even pathologize, leaning into emotion, leaning into spirit that was being done in that room. So I think that that's a really strong example of why the public health control over the space is going to push resources away from the grassroots programmings that people have seen benefit people's lives very deeply and push it more towards more abstract, more, cognitive behavioral therapy sort of frames. That's not to say that cognitive behavioral therapy is inherently like junk science. It makes a lot of sense if you're like smoking to think about your triggers for smoking. Taking somebody's life is a little bit different than that. It's a deeply spiritual, emotional, thinking about, again, your internalized self-hatred, your narratives about your past, and something as basic as cognitive behavioral therapy might work for like phobias and things like smoking. But to assume it can just be copied and pasted on the violence prevention, That is a technique of the nonprofit industrial complex to centralize power and resources into spaces it can control. They could not do that to the people in that room because those perspectives are indigenous to the community in the way where if they become the best practice, Hopkins is no longer centralized in the funding and the academic research perspective of violence prevention.
All right, so let's shift. You mentioned earlier in the beginning of the conversation, abolitionists. So folks that when you think about how to address safety and the emergence of abolitionism, right, of abolition as a perspective that is offered in certain quarters in terms of dealing with the carceral state, the prison system, and all of that. And I think what is happening in Baltimore, given the decline in homicides, non-fatal shootings, the emergence and increased investment in community-based violence prevention, I think that there is something important for those who, call themselves abolitionists. I think it's important to study like what is happening here as a kind of blueprint to think about how to build the infrastructure for community safety outside of law enforcement. Can you expand on the importance, particularly in a context where folks are talking about abolition? Why is what Baltimore is doing so important from that particular perspective and vantage point?
I think it's important to try to be precise here because many folks in the abolitionist space will say, yeah, this is what we've been talking about. We say defund the police, let's fund public health alternatives to violence. And I think the previous conversation is an example of why that's not precise enough. It might actually be leading to the exact co-option of the methodologies that we as a community see as the most beneficial. Because even in Baltimore, there is a question as to whether it is the more nonprofit adjacent, public health driven programs that are doing violence prevention. Are they the reason violence is declining? Or is it more the grassroots, larger community-centric orgs? Now, I don't think that's easy to untangle. I will say that similar to the focused deterrence argument, the traditional public health violence prevention programs have an extreme focus on networks, tight networks, individual groups of people that are adjacent to violence. And that is important at the margin. But you think about the thousands of people in the community that can enter into those networks if one thing goes wrong. So having people engage the entire community and sort of having a more holistic and organic engagement with community beyond the 5, 10, 15, 20 people in an intensive life coaching program. I think that's important. I would also, again, say that for abolitionists to not understand what it means to have Hopkins and the nonprofit industrial complex doing the life coaching compared to the people who were in that room, the fact that the people in that room have been doing the life coaching is why it's been working. And that's the level of precision we need to have abolition be about redistributing power and resources, not just decentering the focus on police. So I would tell folks that, again, the people that work in these programs that are nonprofits tied to Hopkins, I mean, they may call themselves abolitionists. They may go to the protests. They may be your friends. But if you actually want to understand what's driving violence in a city like Baltimore, you have to be able to open your mind and understand that folks from different perspectives that may have ideas that you don't agree with, may have a technology, a cultural skill and ability, that your ignorance around it is meaning that what you're advocating for is not actually been effective to get resources to them. And in many ways, we have to get resources to the ground, the grassroots, despite some of the abolitionists, not because of them. And I think that's a reality check that will allow abolitionists to be more precise if they're willing to actually challenge their assumptive logic, because many of the abolitionists also believe in, evidence-based type stuff. They say the police are not evidence-based. Our abolitionist public health strategies are evidence-based. Now, understanding that can be weaponized against the more grassroots, spiritual folks that are doing the work that we've been talking about.
And I think one of the places that I have both talked about and written about with the precision piece that you're describing is a lack of emphasis on the importance of community control and sovereignty, right? So if we talk about abolition, a part of what it means to build an infrastructure of safety is that the people, us as people of African descent, have to control the institutions, the organizations, the ecosystems that provide safety to our community, and that without that, then everything you're saying about the public health structure becomes the inevitable conclusion. Because there's some people who would say, well, Dayvon, I agree with y'all about the importance of building this alternative structure that the community controls. What I've always been concerned about is that is not a central feature of the discourse that I've heard from some of the more mainstream abolitionists about what it means to create this alternative system of community safety for the community.
Yeah, one thing I've been rolling in my mind, this way to frame this, is I'm more interested in a reconstructionist practice than an abolitionist practice. Mm-hmm. You can have racist abolitionists. In fact, you actually had a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And part of that was, we got to get these black folks back to Africa because they wild. Part of that was, we got to stop slavery because they're going to extend slavery to the West. We want to take the natives' land and keep it for ourselves. We don't want plantations there. We want farms that we own there. So you can be an abolitionist and be racist. Similarly, you can want to stop the violence because it's good for gentrification, because it's good for business, right? So I think looking at things like Reconstruction with W.E.B. Du Bois was like, there were black schools that were like, give us the money, keep your teachers. That were black institutions built during Reconstruction, sort of studying that process of nation management and actual institution building by black people is actually a more effective framework than just abolition. Because you can abolish somebody into nothing. You can abolish somebody into poverty and nothingness. What do you build afterwards, I think, is a more effective starting point.
All right, now to round out the conversation, and to me, this is something that I think, because we're a political advocacy organization. We talk about having a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective, which is unique for organizations engaged in the political arena. And, one of the things that you and I have talked about is that this work around community-based violence prevention is really an essential piece in the larger conversation and work around Black liberation. And I often find that conversations around violence prevention are not centrally had in spaces that I think purport to want to address Black liberation, particularly in the political landscape. And so if you can just talk about, like, what is the importance of the work around community-based violence prevention in the fight for Black liberation? And when we talk about Black liberation, we're talking about in the context of like national liberation, in terms of recognizing this is a society based, on the permanence of racism and white supremacy, that, capitalism is a inherently decadent society. We need to move to more socialism. So we are, in our politics, extremely radical. I don't find, though, that folks that are in our ideological camp are addressing this issue of community-based violence prevention. I think we have found it in some ways pretty central for a variety, whether it's base building, whether it's dealing with some of the ways that oppression is or oppression is injected into us and that we act it out. So there are all these ways that I think it's written about in the traditions that produced us. But again, I don't hear it, certainly not in a lot of progressive spaces. But also I find it lacking in some spaces where it's, conversation is supposed to be about Black liberation. So if you just say a little bit about what is your sense of that? Is that an observation you make? And if so, like, what's your sense of why that is?
I think it's definitely true. And if I had to guess what it's about, I remember there being a conversation, and again, I need to find the video, where someone who called himself an abolitionist was like, there was a debate in the abolition community in the 90s. Do we improve conditions in jail, or do we just focus on getting people out? And they said, we'll do what we can, but we just want to get people out. And they were saying that was an intentional strategic decision that was based upon their analysis of white supremacy, prisons are slavery, we just got to get people out. I think that there was something a lot deeper going on there, and I think that was a mistake. I think what was happening was that working with the type of people that was in jail was traumatizing to the people that wanted to call themselves liberal and abolitionists. They didn't know how to talk to those folks. They maybe felt insecure in their Blackness, or just be able to handle the trauma and the complexity of living in those environments, and it was easier just to sort of say, we're going to work with the courts, we're going to work with our lawyer friends, people we like talking to, who we can trust to get them out, and that's going to be important and feel radical and not subject us to the complexities of the nitty-gritty violence that people are facing in prison. I think something...
No, real quick, because I want to make sure people who are listening are clear. When you talk about the kind of people that were making the determination as to whether to make the conditions inside better or get people out, just be more precise about who are the kind of folks we're talking about who made that decision, and then again link that back to why it is that they made that decision.
So I think these are folks who are probably well-known academics that may call themselves abolitionists.
That's right.
Folks that may work at well-known advocacy organizations like Critical Resistance and things like that. And I think that the idea that those folks who they saw in jail may be the experts and have technology and credibility and community on something like violence prevention makes people feel bad and decenters their desire to feel like the revolutionary vanguard. You know, they write a lot of books. They know a lot of stuff. They're so knowledgeable about so many theoretical concepts. But when it comes to violence prevention, working with the type of people who are actually driving violence, these are working class folks who are not going to be too interested in theoretical conversations. They need their immediate needs met. And they need an engagement with their trauma that isn't just the historical analytical perspective of trauma, but deeply personal and spiritual. And this is not the skill set that has been selected for in many of the abolitionist academic spaces. So I think given that violence prevention work demands such an accountability to what works for working class black folks, that's very different than what works in the academy. That's different than what works even in the courtroom. That's not even to say that work done in the courtroom and with some of the reform movements wasn't useful. But that's very different than working on the ground with people who may carry guns.
So let me say a version of what you just said and let me know if this, is aligned with what you're saying. Because part of what I hear you getting at is that when you talk about the kind of people who are exposed to or who are very popular exponents of confronting, dismantling, overthrowing the carceral system, these tend to be the kind of folks who in their day-to-day everyday life don't interact with people who might sell drugs or might carry guns or might have certain kind of disputes that result in violence. That these are the kind of folks that are not on a consistent basis interacting with that population of people, right? And that a part of the dynamic that is happening there is that it flares up their own insecurities because it calls into question things like their authenticity. Mm-hmm. Like, am I not real enough? Like all those kind of things that come into play that flare up people's insecurities. And instead of confronting that, it is easier to construct political activity and discourses that don't require direct engagement. Or even said more plainly, we're dealing with folks that in some ways are scared of the very black people that they claim they want to advocate for, right? And that now, if that is aligned with what you're describing, one of the things that I would ask you to go a little bit deeper into then is that when we think about some of the ways that, that the folks who are, again, most prone to be swept up in the criminal justice system, which are by and large working class black men that are not in some of these academic environments, then what does that mean then about the nature of the movements that are espousing black liberation, that they feel this level of alienation that you describe from the very people that, when we talk about challenging the carceral system, that we're trying to address?
So I'm going to circle back to your question, but I will say there are some very real theoretical reasons why people may be doing things the way they're doing it. So, for example, they may be saying, look, what it would take to solve this problem would be an engagement with the black elected officials that we feel produce the prison industrial complex. They're too wedded to capitalism. We want to focus on economic redistribution, unions, to give those people jobs at a macro level. And again, I would say theoretically that makes sense when people not only have direct needs, but do you think white union workers were not part of the people who were pushing some of this mass incarceration stuff? Like locking up our own James Foreman, his whole argument is communities were demanding economic and political redistribution of power and public safety. All they got was the police. Do you think that white union workers were part of the reason why they didn't get the other stuff? So you're trying to make alliances with people that have proven over and over again they're not interested in the redistribution necessary to meet this problem. I will also say, and again, these are not things I've heard people say directly. These are things I know they probably believe. We focus on community violence. What about stuff like domestic violence, right? Now, one thing we know is that many of the orgs doing this work have been dealing with intimate partner violence, including things folks don't like to talk about, like same-sex intimate partner violence. And even folks with the Nation of Islam have talked about mediating disputes between women and having to learn and grow and get knowledge about doing that in ways that I don't think these folks theoretically would even believe that's possible, because they've so internalized beliefs about Nation of Islam patriarchy, they don't even think they could do stuff like that. And so I think all these things are important, and I will say that structural violence, intimate partner violence, all this stuff matters. But the focus on community violence being so devastating isn't just because of Fox News and internalized narratives of black pathology. It does something to a people when they see them killing each other. It does something spiritually to people that want to see our black people come together and as a people, as a society, progress and evolve itself. And whether that's literally the fear of feeling like you gotta be in the house, you can't go outside and be with your people, it forestalls the ability of the community to flourish in the way that is a little bit different than other stuff, right? That's not to say other stuff doesn't matter, but it's not caring about other types of violence that drives people to focus on community violence and community gun violence. It's understanding what it means that we have thousands of people potentially willing to take the lives of people that look like them, and how that puts a damper on all the things we need to flourish as a community to deal with all the other stuff that makes that such a prescient focus. And I don't think that understanding has been central to their theoretical understanding of why this issue is so important.
I think that's a wrap.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between myself, Lawrence Grand Prix, and LBS Director of Public Policy, Dayvon Love, on the politics of violence prevention and who deserves the credit for the decline in murders. We don't know what's going to happen in the future with the Trump administration potentially cutting some of the funds from the federal government that will be involved in supporting some of these programs. And these are topics that I explored in a webinar that we did for folks who signed up. Our webinars are free, but we try to do them on Zoom so we know who is in the room with us so we can keep track of that, and we know who we're talking to so we can take them off mute and have a conversation that sometimes it's not always easy to have in public. So some of these webinars have not been posted on YouTube. And going forward, we look forward to potentially doing at least a couple of more webinars on Zoom in 2025 on topics that include the specific in-depth analysis of the limitations of the public health frame for violence prevention and why we have to deal with the increasing consensus in the violence prevention community around this do-both approach, this fund all options on public safety, fund the police and grassroots violence prevention, how the two actually clash with each other in meaningful ways, and while it may be politically beneficial in avoiding the political stigma tied to things like defund the police and so-called anti-police sentiment, the reality is the violence prevention community must actually address its relationship to policing, not just in the context of do you cooperate with police, but what is the political economic arrangement as to who gets funded in our community to do public safety work, community violence prevention, or police. Because the reality is it's very difficult to have both the thing that's causing the wound and exacerbating the violence and the thing that's supposed to heal the violence happening at the same time and call that progress. So these are the conversations that we look forward the holding as an institution here at LBS. And it's your support that allows us to do that. So please continue to support us at lbsbaltimore.com. You can sign up to be a monthly sustainer, giving us a small amount of money every month. That allows us to continue to do the work that we do, continuing to support this podcast, the production cost, the equipment, the editors, helping to get it on YouTube in a format that allows you to actually view it visually, and giving us the resources to be able to edit it so we can produce a good product for you in terms of the audio. In addition to the audio podcast, we also have reports, in-depth written work specifically on violence prevention. We did a work entitled Fear of a Black Planet, which is our comprehensive analysis on the public safety ecosystem here in Baltimore, including a critique of the public health frame for violence prevention that we're looking to expand upon in the future with our research. You can go to our website, lbsbaltimore.com, look on the publications tab, and that will be the spot where we have our in-depth, long-form publications on things like violence prevention, drug policy, and we're looking forward to doing more of those in the future, depending on the support we get from you all. So again, please continue to support Black Liberation Media on Patreon. And as we go forward in this new year, please continue to come with us as we continue to go in search of Black power. I will see you all on the other side.